It was March 25th, 1975. 12-year-old Sheila and 10-year-old Katherine Lyon walked half a mile from their home to Wheaton Plaza. The Lyon sisters were last seen at the mall by their brother around 2 that afternoon. The last person to have seen the girls lives just behind us in this house here. He remembers waving to the girls as they made their way home somewhere between 2:30 and 3 o'clock. They vanished without a trace.
The two sisters were walking just a half mile from their home to Wheaton Plaza Mall in Montgomery County, Maryland, to look at Easter decorations and have a slice of pizza. The two never returned home to their family. A massive search effort came up empty. No bodies, no arrests. The trail went cold. Then last fall, the first significant break, police identifying Lloyd Welch and his uncle as people of interest, connecting them to the mall at the time of the disappearance.
That he didn't walk down the aisle. The grandchildren we didn't have, the sons-in-law we didn't have.
The sisters' bodies have not yet been found, but the search continues. Police focus now in these mountains of Bedford, Virginia.
For nearly 40 years, the Lyon sisters' case looked frozen in place. Two girls left a mall, vanished on a familiar half-mile walk, and every lead seemed to collapse. Then detectives reopened an old 6-page statement from 1975, a statement marked as a lie. The teenager who gave it had been brushed aside as a reward seeker. But his old mugshot looked almost exactly like the sketch witnesses had described. So here is the question. Did police overlook the answer from the very beginning? I built this story from news footage, interrogation clips, reports, and archived timelines. You are standing inside the Lyon family home on the evening of March 25th, 1975. Not at the mall yet, not with the detectives, not in the middle of a search. Just inside a normal family house, on what should have been a normal Tuesday night, watching a mother wait for two daughters who were supposed to be home hours ago. At first, you can almost understand the feeling in the room. It is not panic, not yet. It is irritation, the kind of irritation any parent might feel when children lose track of time. Sheila and Katherine had been told to be home by 4. That was the rule. Simple, clear, be back before dinner. But 4 passes. Then 5, then 6. And by the time the clock moves closer to 7, the mood inside that house is no longer about children being late. Something has shifted. You can feel it. The small excuses begin to collapse one by one. Maybe they stopped to talk to friends. Maybe they forgot the time. Maybe they took longer at the mall. Maybe they are walking home right now. But if they are walking home, why are they not at the door? A news report would later summarize it in a way that sounds almost too simple for something this heavy. Reporter, their mother told them to be home by 4. Anchor, but they never returned. And that is where the fear begins to settle in. Because Sheila and Katherine Lyon had not gone far. They had not left town. They had not taken some strange route into an unfamiliar place. They had walked to Wheaton Plaza, a shopping mall about half a mile from home. Half a mile. A distance so short that it almost makes the whole thing harder to understand. You hear that number, and your mind tries to make sense of it. Half a mile means close. Half a mile means familiar. Half a mile means a walk they could have made without anyone thinking this would become the last confirmed stretch of their day. Earlier, sometime between late morning and noon, the sisters had left the house. Sheila was 12, Katherine was 10. They were on spring break, and Wheaton Plaza had Easter decorations on display. That was the plan. Go to the mall, look around, get something to eat, maybe meet friends, then come home by 4. Nothing about that plan sounds alarming. That is the most unsettling part. You do not get a warning sign. You do not get a moment where everyone in the room suddenly knows something is wrong. You just get a normal plan, a normal walk, a normal shopping mall, and then a silence that grows bigger with every hour. At the mall, the girls stopped at the Orange Bowl, a pizza place inside Wheaton Plaza. Their older brother, Jay, saw them there. He saw them eating. He did not stop because there was no reason to. They were where they were supposed to be. They were doing exactly what everyone expected them to be doing. So he kept going, and years later, that ordinary moment would become one of the last family memories tied to that day. Not a dramatic goodbye, not a warning, Just a brother seeing his sisters eating pizza at the mall and continuing with his own afternoon. That is how quickly an ordinary detail can turn into evidence. From there, the timeline tightens. Witnesses would later help police place the girls at the mall, then near the route home. Sometime between about 2:30 and 3 in the afternoon, a friend reportedly saw them walking west, in the direction of home. And if you are standing in the Lyon house that evening, that detail would make the waiting even worse. Because they were not last seen heading deeper into the mall. They were not last seen wandering somewhere far away. They were seen going the way they were supposed to go, toward home. So what happened in between? That is the question that turns the room cold. Not all at once, but slowly, minute by minute. Every sound outside might matter. Every car passing by might make someone look up. Every footstep that is not theirs makes the house feel quieter. And now, I want you to place yourself there for a second. If you were the parent in that house, what time would make the worry become real? 4:30? 5? 6? Or would it be closer to 7, when the daylight is fading and every normal explanation starts to feel thin? Because by 7, waiting was no longer waiting. It was fear. The kind of fear that does not need proof yet. The kind that arrives before the phone call, before the search, before the reporters, before the case has a name. It is the fear of knowing 2 children should be close enough to come home, but somehow they are not. And that is the part that still echoes through this entire story. 2 sisters left for a mall half a mile away. They were expected home by 4. They were seen eating pizza. They were seen heading back. Then one short walk became a missing space that lasted 42 years. Wheaton Plaza was not supposed to be the kind of place people feared. That is what makes this part of the story so hard to shake. It was not some hidden road. It was not an isolated field. It was not a place far outside the girls' normal world. It was a shopping mall, close to home, familiar to local families, filled with stores, food, decorations, and kids with time to spend during spring break. For Sheila and Katherine Lyon, Wheaton Plaza was not an adventure into the unknown. It was part of everyday life. And on March 25, 1975, that everyday place became the last ordinary place anyone could clearly put them. They had gone there to see the Easter displays. They stopped at the Orange Bowl, a pizza place inside the mall. That detail matters because it places them in public, around people, in a setting where nothing should have been able to disappear without being noticed. Their older brother Jay saw them there. He saw his sisters eating, and because everything looked normal, he kept going. No alarm, no reason to step in, no reason to think that moment would become one of the last solid points in the timeline. But there were other eyes on the girls that day. And this is where the mall begins to feel different. One neighborhood boy later told police he saw the sisters speaking with an older man near the Orange Bowl. The man was described as carrying a briefcase with a tape recorder inside. He appeared to be using the recorder to draw attention, the kind of object that could make children curious. In a crowded mall, that may not have seemed strange right away. A man with a tape recorder, a few kids gathered around, a small public interaction. But looking back, the detail feels heavier. Because if someone wanted to start a conversation with children in a place where adults were everywhere, a tape recorder could make that conversation look harmless. It could make it seem like a game, a question, a little moment of attention in the middle of a busy mall. At the same time, there was another description. A girl around Sheila and Katherine's age told detectives about a younger man, not the older man with the recorder. Someone else. She said this man had been looking at the sisters for a long time, not in a quick passing way, not like someone glancing across a food court. Long enough that it felt wrong. Long enough that the girls noticed. That is important, because children often sense discomfort before they have the language to explain it. They may not know what they are seeing, but they know when something feels off. And according to that account, this was not just a background figure in the mall. This was someone whose attention stood out. You can imagine the exchange later. When police were trying to understand what she had seen, witness, He kept looking at them, not once, not by accident, long enough that it felt wrong. Detective. So she noticed him. Witness. She noticed him enough to speak up. That is the detail I keep coming back to here. Not because it gives a full answer. It does not. But because it shows that something about that mall visit had already become unusual before the girls ever failed to come home. So now there are two images sitting side by side. One, an older man with a briefcase and a tape recorder, able to gather attention in a public place. Two, a younger man watching the girls closely enough that another child remembered it and told police. And the problem is, in 1975, those two images did not combine into one clear answer. They became separate leads, separate sketches, separate possibilities. Police had descriptions, but not certainty. They had people who saw something, but not enough to prove what it meant. That is how a case can become complicated very early. It is not always because there are no clues. Sometimes it is because there are too many pieces, and none of them lock into place. So let me ask you this. Which detail do you think matters more, the man with the tape recorder, or the younger man who kept watching them? Because one of those descriptions would stay buried in the case files for decades. A sketch would sit there, almost waiting. And nearly 40 years later, when detectives looked at it again, that old image would help pull the Lyon sisters' case back from silence. After Sheila and Katherine did not come home, the search began the way searches often begin. Wide, urgent, and full of hope. Police looked. Volunteers looked. Neighbors looked. The National Guard was brought in. People moved through wooded areas, checked open spaces, searched places children might hide, fall asleep, or get lost. Storm drains were examined. Vacant houses were checked. Ponds and nearby water areas were searched. Every possible place that could explain two missing girls was treated like it might hold the answer, but nothing came back. No clear sign. No simple explanation. No moment where someone could say, "This is what happened after they left the mall." And when a case starts like that, every lead feels important. Every call feels urgent. Every witness may be the one who changes everything. But the danger is this: not every lead pulls investigators closer. Some pull them sideways. Some pull them backward. Some open doors that look promising, only to lead nowhere. That is what happened in the Lyon sisters' case. One of the first major twists came on April 4th, 1975, about 10 days after the girls vanished. An anonymous caller contacted the family with a demand. He told John Lyon to leave a briefcase with $10,000 in a courthouse restroom in Annapolis. Think about that for a second. A father whose daughters are missing is suddenly being told there may be a way to bring them back. Even if the call sounds suspicious, how do you ignore it? How do you risk being wrong? So John followed the instructions with police guidance. But instead of $10,000, he left $101 in the briefcase. That amount was chosen carefully. It was enough to change the legal weight of what the caller was doing, while still protecting the family from handing over the full amount to someone who might be lying. The briefcase was left, and then nothing. No one came to get it. Later, the caller reached out again and said there were too many officers around the courthouse. John Lyon pushed back with the one request any parent would make. Caller, leave the money in the courthouse restroom. John Lyon, I need to hear my daughters first. Narrator, after that, the caller never gave the family what they asked for. And then, the caller disappeared from the story. So here is the question. Do you think a ransom call that no one follows through on is a real lead, or just noise created around a family's worst moment? Because that was only one door investigators had to open. Another lead came from Manassas, Virginia. A witness reported seeing two girls who looked like Sheila and Katherine in the back of a station wagon. The description caught attention quickly. The car had Maryland plates, but the full number could not be confirmed. People heard the report, and for a moment it felt like the case might be moving. Maybe the girls had been taken out of Maryland. Maybe someone had seen the vehicle that mattered. But that lead too began to weaken. The plate information was incomplete. The sighting created public attention, but it did not produce a solid path forward. What first sounded like a possible break became another uncertain piece in a growing pile of uncertain pieces, and then came the names. Fred Howard Coffey became one of the men investigators looked at. He had a concerning background and had been near the region not long after the girls disappeared. On paper, he looked like someone police could not ignore, but looking at someone is not the same as connecting them. Investigators could not firmly tie him to Sheila and Katherine. Then there was Raymond Molesky. Molesky drew attention for several reasons. Some thought he resembled one of the early sketches. He had a history that made police take him seriously. There were also claims that he knew something about the Lyon sisters case. But again, when investigators searched and checked what they could, they did not find the proof they needed. That is the pattern in this part of the case. A call that might matter. A vehicle sighting that might matter. A man near the area who might matter. Another man who looked close enough to a sketch that he might matter. But might is not enough. And before we keep going, if you are following this case with me and want more deep dives like this, take a second to subscribe to the channel. These stories are not just about what happened. They are about what was missed, what was misunderstood, and what still deserves a closer look. Because the Lyon sisters case was not empty. That is important to understand. It was not a case with no clues. It was almost the opposite. There were too many possible doors, and each one seemed like it could lead to the truth. But one by one, they opened into silence. And while investigators chased calls, cars, names, and old suspicions, one strange 6-page statement from 1975 was sitting in the file. At the time, it looked like another false lead. Years later, it would look very different. By 2013, the Lyon sisters case had become the kind of file that almost felt too heavy to touch. Not because nobody cared. People did care. Detectives had cared for decades. Families in Maryland still remembered. The names Sheila and Katherine Lyon still carried weight. But after so many years, so many tips, and so many wrong turns, a case like this can start to feel like a locked room with no key left inside it. And then Detective Chris Hamrock went back into the old records. That detail matters because this was not a brand new clue falling from the sky. This was not someone suddenly walking in with a clean answer after almost 40 years. What Hamrock found had been there all along. 6 pages. A statement from 1975. A statement given by an 18-year-old named Lloyd Lee Welch. 1 week after Sheila and Katherine disappeared, Welch had gone to authorities and claimed he had seen something connected to the girls being taken from the mall. On the surface, that should have made him important. He was young, he was local enough to know the area, and he was placing himself close to one of the biggest child disappearance cases in the country. But at the time, police did not believe him. They thought he was making it up. There was reward money being offered, and investigators believed Welch may have been trying to get attention or profit from the case. He failed a lie detector test. Then he backed away from his own story. And once that happened, the file was marked in a way that made it easier to dismiss. That is one of the most important psychological turns in this case, because once someone gets labeled a liar, everything they say starts to carry that stain. Every sentence becomes suspect. Every detail sounds contaminated. And in many cases, that instinct makes sense. Investigators have to sort truth from noise. They cannot chase every person who wants attention. But here is the problem. A person can lie and still know something. A person can make up part of a story to hide the part that is real. A person can place blame somewhere else because standing too close to the truth is dangerous for them. And that is where Lloyd Welch becomes impossible to ignore. Decades later, when Hamrock looked back at that 6-page statement, he was not just reading an old failed lead. He was looking at a man who had inserted himself into the case almost immediately, then disappeared into the background of the file. And then came the image. Investigators had an old composite sketch from 1975. It came from a witness who described a younger man at Wheaton Plaza, someone who had been watching the Lyon sisters long enough for the behavior to stand out. That sketch had sat in the case for years. Like the statement, it was there, but it had never brought the case home. Then detectives compared it with a mugshot of Lloyd Welch, and the resemblance was hard to ignore. Not proof by itself, not enough to close a case, but enough to stop a detective in his tracks. Because suddenly, Welch was not just a teenager who had told a strange story in 1975. He looked like the man a witness remembered from the mall. And once you see that connection, you have to go back and ask a very different question. Was Lloyd Welch lying because he knew nothing? Or was he lying because he knew too much? That is the part I could not get past. The case did not break open because of something new. It began to move because someone finally looked at an old piece of paper with fresh eyes. And there was another detail, smaller but still important. In 1977, just 2 years after the girls vanished, Welch had a mugshot taken after a break-in near Wheaton Plaza that placed him again inside the geography of the case. The mall was not some random place in his memory. The area was connected to his own movements. So when detectives finally sat down with him years later, they had more than a name. They had the old statement, they had the sketch, they had the mugshot, they had the location, and they had a man whose story had never really been solved, only set aside. You can almost imagine the moment in the interview room when detectives put the past back in front of him. Detective, this is your old statement. You were living on Baltimore Avenue, right? Welch, I don't remember saying that about the mall. Detective, but this is your statement. That exchange is simple, but it says a lot. Welch was no longer talking in open space. He was being pulled back into his own words. And now I want to ask you this. Do you think police in 1975 truly missed something? Or did they simply not have enough at the time to understand what they were looking at? Because after almost 40 years, the answer was not hidden in a mountain, a rumor, or a new witness. It was sitting in 6 pages. Nobody kept looking at. When Detective Dave Davis finally sat across from Lloyd Lee Welch, he was not talking to a blank name in an old file anymore. He was talking to a man who had been connected to the Lyon sisters case from the very beginning, then pushed aside for decades as someone who had lied. Welch was already behind bars on another matter, which meant detectives had access to him. But access was not the same as truth, and Davis understood something important right away. If he pushed too hard, Welch might shut down. If he accused him too fast, Welch might stop talking. So the goal, at least in the beginning, was simple. Keep him speaking. Let him tell the story. Let him feel safe enough to explain himself, because with someone like Welch, the truth might not come in a straight line. It might come through mistakes, repeats, and details he did not realize he was giving away. At first, Welch tried to stay in the role of a witness. He said he saw a man put 2 girls into a car. He said something about it did not look right. He said, the girls seemed scared. On the surface, that sounded like the same kind of claim he had made back in 1975. A man nearby, 2 girls, a vehicle, and Welch, standing at a distance as someone who only watched. You can almost hear the room slow down around that moment. Detective, what did you see? Welch, I saw a man put 2 girls in the back of a car. It didn't look right. Welch, that part is hard. It's been over 40 years. That answer sounds cautious, maybe even believable for a moment. After all, 40 years is a long time. Memory changes, places blur, cars blur, people blur. But then the details started moving too much. In 1975, Welch had said the event was connected to Wheaton Plaza. Decades later, he claimed he did not really remember the mall. At one point, the car was described one way, then another, a black Plymouth. Then the older detail of a Camaro came back into the conversation. Sometimes Welch sounded like a man who had only seen something from the outside. Other times, he seemed to know too much about what happened after the girls left public view. And that is where the interview became less about one answer and more about the pattern of his answers. Because a person who simply misremembers may get a detail wrong. But Welch was not just misremembering one detail. His whole position kept changing. Where he was, what he saw, who was involved, which car mattered, whether he was near the mall, whether he knew the people he was naming. Every time detectives pressed one weak spot, the story shifted to protect another. That is why you cannot simply take Welch at his word, but you also cannot ignore him. And this is the difficult part of the case. Welch was unreliable, but he was not useless. His lies had shape. His contradictions had direction. He kept trying to move blame away from himself, but while doing that, he kept circling back to the same fixed points: the mall, a vehicle, relatives, a basement, and Virginia. Those repeated details mattered. Then came one of the strangest moments. At one point, when investigators were out of the room, Welch appeared to realize the situation had changed. He was no longer controlling the story as easily as he thought. Welch, oh, they got me. Narrator. That small line mattered because right after it, his story shifted again. That sentence is chilling not because it explains everything. That sentence is chilling not because it explains everything, but because it sounds like a man understanding that the old distance between himself and the case was disappearing. After that, Welch did what he seemed to do whenever pressure rose. He adjusted. He gave another version, then another. He brought in names. He moved blame. He put himself closer, then tried to pull himself back again. He admitted pieces, then wrapped those pieces in claims that made someone else look worse. It was not a confession in a clean, direct sense. It was more like watching someone build walls while accidentally leaving gaps between the bricks, and those gaps were what detectives needed. At this point, the question is not, do we believe Lloyd Welch? The better question is, which parts of Lloyd Welch's story survive after every version changes? Because the parts that kept surviving became the real map. A mall, a car, a family connection, a hidden room. A trip toward Virginia. So let me ask you this. If someone keeps changing their story, but the same few details keep coming back, which part would you trust, the story they want you to hear, or the details they cannot stop repeating? Because the more Welch talked, the less this looked like a man who knew nothing, and the more it looked like the old file had only caught the edge of something much bigger. At some point, detectives had to stop following Lloyd Welch's story in a straight line. Because there was no straight line, every time he spoke, the shape of the story changed. A different person became responsible. A different vehicle seemed important. A different memory appeared, disappeared, then came back with new details. If investigators tried to treat each version as a clean timeline, they would get lost inside it. So they did something smarter. They stopped focusing on the full story Welch wanted them to believe and started focusing on the pieces that would not go away. And those pieces kept coming back. A house with a rear entrance, a basement, a room below the main living space that very few people would have noticed from the street, a vehicle, a Green Army-style duffel bag, a trip toward Virginia, and a family property on Taylor's Mountain. That pattern mattered because Welch could change the names. He could change his distance from what happened. He could say he only saw something, then admit he knew more, then blame someone else again. But certain details kept surviving every version. That is usually when investigators start paying closer attention. Not because a repeated detail is automatically true, but because repetition can show where a person's memory, fear, or guilt keeps circling back. And in Welch's case, the circle kept moving away from Wheaton Plaza and toward the Welch family. The investigation widened. Detectives began speaking with relatives. Some said very little. Some seemed careful. Some gave answers that raised more questions than they solved. But then one detail began to stand out in a way that was difficult to ignore. The green duffel bag. According to accounts connected to the family, Lloyd had come to the mountain property with a green military-style bag. And what made this detail stronger was not just that one person remembered it. It was that more than one person described something similar, even though they were not close and had their own family conflict. That is important, because when two people who do not have a smooth relationship still point to the same object, investigators have to ask why. You can imagine that interview room, with the detective trying not to push too hard, but also not letting the detail slide away. Detective, do you remember the bag? Relative? It was green. Army style. Full. Detective, and Lloyd brought it there. Relative. That is what I remember. That is not a full answer. But it is enough to make the bag more than just a passing detail in one unreliable man's story. So let me ask you this. Do you think the green bag was a real clue, or just a detail repeated so many times that it started to feel important? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those moments where the case turns from statement to evidence, from memory to location. And if you are following this investigation with me, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps keep these deep dive cases moving, and I want to hear which detail you think detectives should have followed sooner. Because from there, the search moved to Taylor's Mountain. And that shift changed the scale of the case. For years, the Lyon sisters case had been centered around a shopping mall in Maryland. Wheaton Plaza was the last ordinary place. It was where witnesses saw the girls. It was where sketches were made. It was where the public memory stayed frozen. But now, after decades, investigators were looking at a remote mountain area in Bedford County, Virginia, tied to the Welch family. A news report from the scene captured how strange that turn felt. Reporter, agents and deputies are digging on this hillside. Sheriff sighed. New leads brought them to these specific spots. Narrator, after 40 years, the search had moved from a mall to a mountain. That sentence almost tells the whole story by itself. From a public food court to a quiet hillside. From pizza and Easter decorations to an evidence recovery team working through earth, weather, and time. Investigators searched areas connected to an old fire site. They found small items that could not be ignored. A piece of wire that raised questions because Sheila had worn glasses. Objects that resembled small beads, and badly aged samples that suggested this location needed serious attention. But there was a problem. Time had taken too much. The material was too degraded to give investigators the clean confirmation they wanted. It did not hand them a perfect answer. It did not erase every doubt. It did not give the Lyon family the full truth in the way anyone would have hoped. And yet, it mattered. Because Taylor's Mountain was not random. It connected back to Welch. It connected back to the family. It connected back to the recurring details he could not stop returning to. That is what makes this part so powerful. The case did not move forward because Welch suddenly became honest. It moved forward because detectives learned how to listen around his lies. They looked past the changing story. They followed the pieces that stayed. The basement, the vehicle, the family names, the green bag, Virginia, Taylor's Mountain. And once those details lined up, the question was no longer whether Lloyd Welch knew something. The question was how much he had known all along. By this point, the Lyon sisters case was no longer just about Lloyd Lee Welch. That is one of the hardest turns in the investigation to understand. Lloyd was the man in custody. Lloyd was the one whose old statement brought detectives back into the file. Lloyd was the one whose changing stories kept leading investigators from the mall, to a basement, to Virginia, to Taylor's Mountain. But every time detectives pressed him, Lloyd did something familiar. He moved the blame. First, he was only a witness. Then he knew someone involved. Then it was a cousin. Then it was his uncle. Then his father's name entered the story. Each time the pressure came closer to him, the responsibility shifted toward another Welch family member. On the surface, that could make the entire case feel weaker. After all, if a man keeps changing names, why believe any name he gives? But the problem was not that simple, because even when Lloyd changed the people in the story, certain pieces still matched places, records, and witness accounts. The family property in Virginia was real. The old house was real. The basement detail did not vanish. The green duffel bag kept coming back. Taylor's Mountain was not something detectives invented. It was tied to the Welch family, and it became one of the most important locations in the reopened investigation. So investigators were forced to look beyond Lloyd as a single suspect and ask a broader question. Who else knew? That question is where the wall began to appear. Some relatives were dead by the time the investigation gained real momentum. Some were old. Some seemed careful with their words. Some were believed to know more than they were willing to say. And when a case is already almost 40 years old, silence becomes more than frustrating. It becomes a kind of evidence gap. Because silence can protect people, it can also destroy the chance to prove what really happened. Lloyd mentioned his uncle Richard Welch more than once. Richard became a person of interest, but he was never convicted in the Lyon sisters case. That distinction matters. Being named, questioned, or suspected is not the same as being legally proven responsible. And in a case this old, that difference becomes everything. Richard's wife also became part of the wider legal picture when questions arose about what was said before a grand jury. That tells us investigators believed there were people around the family who were not being fully open. But again, belief is not enough. Pressure is not enough. Suspicion is not enough. The law needs proof, and proof becomes harder to build when time has taken so much away. This is the part of the case where you can feel the limits of investigation. Detectives can interview. They can compare statements. They can search properties. They can dig. They can test what remains, but they cannot force the past to stay fresh. They cannot make every witness remember clearly. They cannot bring back people who died before the full story came into focus. And they cannot turn every suspicion into a conviction. That is why the Welch family's silence became such a major part of the mystery. It was not just about people refusing to talk. It was about what that refusal did to the case. It left detectives trying to build a truth from fragments. Old interviews, partial memories, changing statements, degraded evidence, and one central figure who seemed to know more than he wanted to admit. Some relatives reportedly suggested Lloyd could not have acted alone. That idea followed the investigation for years. But again, this is where we have to be careful. A theory can feel strong and still fall short in court. A family member can sound suspicious and still never be legally tied to the crime. A repeated name can matter and still not be enough. That is what makes this section so unsettling. The case had movement. It had direction. It had locations. It had patterns. But when investigators tried to widen the circle, they kept running into age, death, fear, loyalty, and silence. And maybe that is the real question here. When a family stays quiet for years, what does that silence mean? Does it mean fear? Does it mean loyalty? Does it mean self-protection? Or does it mean everyone is waiting for someone else to carry the burden of telling the truth? Because in the Lyon sisters' case, Lloyd Welch eventually stood in court. His name became the one attached to the final legal outcome. But the deeper story never felt completely settled. There were too many names around him. Too many statements that shifted. Too many people who may have known something. And too many years where the truth, whatever it was, stayed locked behind a family wall that detectives could damage, but never fully break. On September 12, 2017, the Lyon sisters case finally reached a courtroom in Bedford County, Virginia. And just think about what that means. 42 years had passed since Sheila and Katherine Lyon sat inside Wheaton Plaza, eating pizza at the Orange Bowl, on a spring break afternoon that should have ended with both of them walking back home. 42 years since Mary Lyon waited for them at dinner. 42 years since John Lyon had to live with a question no parent should have to carry. Now, after all of that time, John and Mary were sitting just a few feet behind Lloyd Lee Welch, the man whose name had been sitting in the file since 1975, the man who had once been dismissed as someone looking for reward money, the man whose old statement, old mugshot, and changing stories helped reopen one of the most haunting cases in Maryland history. But this courtroom moment was complicated, because yes, this was the day the law finally moved. This was the day Welch stood before a judge and pleaded guilty. This was the day the case reached a legal answer. But a legal answer is not always the same thing as the full truth. That is the tension at the center of this part of the story. Welch admitted enough to be held responsible. He admitted involvement in the events that took Sheila and Katherine away from safety. Under the law, that mattered. It meant the court could move forward. It meant the family no longer had to hear officials say there was not enough to charge the person who had been tied to so many key pieces of the investigation. But even then, Welch did not give the clean, complete account the family wanted. He did not stand there and explain everything from beginning to end. He did not answer every question. He did not give the Lyon family the full map of what happened after their daughters left the mall. Instead, just as he had done in interviews, he continued to shift the darkest parts of the story onto others. That is what makes this courtroom scene feel so heavy. There was accountability, but there was not full clarity. The judge sentenced Lloyd Welch to 48 years in prison. Welch was 60 years old at the time, which meant the sentence would almost certainly keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. In one sense, that was the system finally saying, "This case has an answer. This man is responsible." But what could the sentence not do? It could not bring Sheila and Katherine home. It could not give John and Mary 42 years back. It could not erase the birthdays that never happened, the dinners never shared, or the ordinary family life that was cut off after one short trip to the mall. And it still could not give the family a confirmed place to visit their daughters. That is one of the most painful parts of this case. A courtroom can deliver a sentence. A judge can read the terms. A guilty plea can become part of the official record. But none of that automatically fills the empty space left behind when remains are not fully recovered, when locations remain uncertain, and when the person at the center of the case refuses to give everything he knows. So let me ask you this. Is a guilty plea enough to call a case closed if the biggest questions are still hanging in the air? Because outside the courtroom, John Lyon gave a statement that said more than any legal language could. He thanked the investigators. He recognized the years they had given to the case. And then he said something simple, tired, and deeply human. The family had waited a long, long time. They were tired. They just wanted to go home. That line stays with you. Because it does not sound like victory. It sounds like exhaustion. And maybe that is the most honest way to understand the ending of the Lyon sisters' case in court. It was not a triumphant ending. It was not the kind of ending where every question gets answered and every wound gets named. It was a legal ending, reached after decades of missed chances, renewed investigation, shifting stories, family silence, and fragments of evidence that could only take the case so far. The court could name Lloyd Welch responsible, but it could not force him to become fully honest. It could not turn a broken timeline into a complete one. It could not make 42 years feel any shorter. And as John and Mary Lyon left that courtroom, the case had finally changed shape. It was no longer officially unanswered in the same way, but it was still not whole. Because sometimes justice arrives late. And sometimes, even when it arrives, it does not bring every truth with it. Even after Lloyd Lee Welch stood in court, even after the guilty plea, even after the sentence, the Lyon sisters' case still did not feel completely answered. That is the uncomfortable truth here. The law reached a conclusion. A man was held responsible. The family finally heard a judge put legal weight behind what investigators had spent years rebuilding. But when you step back from the courtroom and look at the full timeline, there are still empty spaces that never fully close. And the first empty space is the most basic one. What exactly happened after Sheila and Katherine left the mall? We know they were seen at Wheaton Plaza. We know they were at the Orange Bowl. We know their older brother Jay saw them eating pizza. We know witnesses placed them around the mall that afternoon. And we know that sometime between about 2:30 and 3 o'clock, a friend reportedly saw them walking west in the direction of home. That detail should make the case simpler, but it does not, because after that, the timeline falls into darkness. From around 2 to 4, there is no confirmed sequence that gives a clean answer. Were they approached before leaving the mall? Were they stopped after they started home? Did they know the person speaking to them? Did they hesitate? Did something happen quickly, or was there a longer interaction no one fully understood at the time? Those questions still matter because the distance was so short. Half a mile should have been easy to understand, but in this case, that half mile became the biggest unknown of all. Then there is the second question. What was Lloyd Welch's true role? This is where the case becomes difficult again. Welch placed himself near the story almost from the beginning. He gave that old statement in 1975. He later became important because of the sketch, the mugshot, the interviews, and the repeated details that led detectives toward his family and toward Virginia. But what exactly was he? Was he at the mall that day? Did he know from the beginning what had happened? Was he trying to protect himself only, or was he also protecting other people? That question is still hard to answer, because Welch never gave a clean version that could be trusted from beginning to end. He changed names, he changed locations, he changed how close he was to the event. He acted like a witness, then sounded like someone with inside knowledge, then pushed the worst parts of the story onto others. So the real issue is not whether Welch knew something. The issue is how much he knew, and when he knew it. The third question is about the man with the tape recorder. That figure appeared early in the investigation. Witnesses described an older man near the mall, carrying a briefcase with a tape recorder, speaking with children. For years, that image stayed in the case. It was strange enough to matter, but not clear enough to solve anything. So who was he? Was he a completely separate person? Was that lead just noise in a case already full of confusion? Or was he somehow part of the same larger picture? That is one of the frustrating parts of this case. Not every strange detail can be tied neatly to the final suspect. Some details remain loose. But loose does not always mean meaningless. Sometimes it means investigators never had enough to place it correctly. Then comes the fourth question, and maybe the most painful one for the investigation itself. Why was Welch's 1975 statement not examined more deeply? At the time, police had reasons to doubt him. He failed a lie detector test. He changed his story. He seemed like someone trying to get close to reward money. So the decision to dismiss him did not come out of nowhere. But looking back, it is hard not to wonder. What if the 6-page statement had been treated differently? What if the sketch had been compared sooner? What if the burglary mugshot from 1977 had been looked at next to the witness description much earlier? This does not mean detectives in 1975 had an easy answer in front of them. They were dealing with pressure, false leads, public fear, and limited tools. But the fact remains. The same old file that was once pushed aside eventually helped reopen the case. And that brings us to Taylor's Mountain. What did that mountain really give back? It gave investigators a direction. It gave them a location tied to Welch's family. It gave them small physical items that could not be ignored. It gave them statements from relatives. It gave them a place to dig, a place to test, a place where the case moved from rumor into something more grounded. But it did not give everything. The evidence was too damaged by time. The answers were incomplete. The family still did not receive the full certainty they deserved. Taylor's Mountain became important, but it did not become the final page. So maybe the Lyon sisters case is not only a story about a man being caught late. It is a story about a file full of noise, a witness who was dismissed, a sketch that waited too long, a family that may have known more than it said, and a truth that took 42 years to reach court, but still arrived with pieces missing. So I want to ask you this. Out of all the unanswered parts, which detail is the hardest for you to let go of? The missing hours, Welch's changing story, the tape recorder man, the old 6-page statement, or Taylor's Mountain? Because even after the legal ending, the case still leaves one feeling behind. Some truths were found, but not all of them were recovered. In the end, the Lyon sisters' case comes back to a distance that should have been simple. Half a mile, that was all that stood between Wheaton Plaza and home. Half a mile from a shopping mall to a family house. 2 hours to get back before dinner. 2 girls on spring break. 2 birthdays just days away. And then, somehow, that short walk became a question their family had to carry for 42 years. That is what makes this story stay with you. Not just the investigation, not just Lloyd Welch, not just the old statement, the sketch, the interviews, or Taylor's Mountain. It is the ordinary beginning. Sheila and Katherine were not walking into a mystery. They were going to the mall. They were eating pizza. They were looking at Easter decorations. They were doing something thousands of children did without anyone thinking it would become the last normal afternoon of their lives. And before this story ends, it matters to remember them as more than names in a file. Sheila was 12 years old. She wore glasses. She was just days away from turning 13. Katherine was 10. She was also days away from a birthday. Their family had plans, dinner, routines, and a future they expected to keep living together. That is why this case should never be reduced to the man who was finally convicted. Because the most important lesson here is not only that a suspect can be missed, it is that small details matter. A child saying someone made them uncomfortable matters. A look that feels wrong matters. A sketch matters. A statement marked as false may still contain something real, and an investigation does not only need one big breakthrough. Sometimes it needs someone patient enough to return to the smallest pieces and ask, again, what they might mean. What I couldn't get past was this. The answer may not have appeared out of nowhere in 2013. It may have been sitting in the file since 1975. That does not mean everything was easy to see back then. Investigators were dealing with pressure, fear, false leads, and limited tools. But looking back, the 6-page statement feels like a warning the case left behind for itself. Lloyd Welch had been there in the paperwork. The sketch had been there. The questions had been there. The questions had been there. They just had not come together yet. John Lyon lived long enough to see a courtroom answer. Mary Lyon waited through decades before the final legal chapter arrived. Their son Jay, the brother who once saw Sheila and Katherine eating pizza at the mall, later became a homicide detective himself, giving other families the answers his own family spent so long waiting for. So now I want to ask you, which detail in this case feels the hardest to ignore? The young man in the sketch, the green bag, the silence around the Welch family, or the fact that Welch's name was in the file almost from the start? And do you believe Lloyd Welch acted alone? Or did the truth stretch beyond what the courtroom could prove? Because if one overlooked statement changed the case after nearly 40 years, what else was sitting in those files waiting for someone to look again?